Okay, guys, it's time to start presentation number 10. It's kind of weird. I'm in here recording this as I sit in my office while everybody's in having driver's ed in the other room, so that's kind of weird. But we're ready to start talking to you about nationalism and sectionalism and the era of James Monroe's presidency. A lot of historians have specialties and things that they like. Some specialize on the teachings of the founders, the founding of our country, developing a republic. Others love talking about World War II or FDR and the rise of progressivism. But my specialty and my favorite time of history is what we're going to be talking about right now is the time period leading up to and ending with the Civil War. So I'm really excited to share my favorite era of American history with you guys. So let's get started. This period of American history sees the United States developing its own identity, and it led to a period of a strong feeling of nationalism and developing also the idea of sectionalism kind of became more ingrained in the people as well. Jefferson's embargo that we talked about, which he put in place to help protect the United States during problems during wars in Europe with Napoleon, his embargo forced Americans to look inward for the production of their finished goods. This led to the American Industrial Revolution and a surge of economic growth. The Industrial Revolution had been taking place in Europe for quite some time, especially in England, but it finally trickled across the Atlantic to the United States during this time period. A protective tariff was placed on foreign goods imported from foreign countries, and this helped protect and create new American industries that offset foreign competition, and this led to a better canal system and better roads, and the idea was proposed for a great national university, which never really came to fruition. It also came up, we knew that we needed a new national bank. The first charter ended in 1811 under James Madison. However, he realized that needed to be put back in place because at the time different banks issued their own currency and that played with the value of the dollar. The result was chronic instability in the banking sector, and he realized that we needed to have a national bank, so the second national bank was chartered as well. This charter would last for 20 years. This picture illustrates the United States, especially in the North at this time, where the more agrarian parts of the North were being pushed to the side and having to make way for industry and factories that were being built to help increase our economy. This tariff, which is a fee imposed by the government is the one who collects those fees on imported goods, was put in place to protect fledgling American industry from competing British imports. And this tariff divided the country's opinion along sectional lines. We talked before about how the North was more of a shipping, industrial, manufacturing, banking section of the country, whereas the South was an agrarian section. Now we have a couple of new sections of the country coming into play. The section between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River had been settled after the Revolution, and then in 1803 with the purchase of Louisiana, they started spreading even farther west, and this brought different ideas. Each section of the country thought that their ideas were the most important and would fight to have the economic needs of their citizens at the forefront. The North, where most of the manufacturing base was located, was for this tariff of 1816, but the South was against it. The agrarian economy of the South depended on shipping goods abroad, so their raw goods, their cotton, their tobacco, their sugar. They had agents go abroad to sell those, and those agents would purchase other items in exchange, fabric, luxuries, furniture, that kind of thing, and then they would ship them back to America. The Southerners were upset because they were the ones who were primarily forced to pay the tariff of 1816. The War of 1812 also revealed several shortcomings of the United States. One of these was the transportation infrastructure. The first attempt to fix this problem was construction of the Cumberland or National Road, which connected the original 13 colony states to the rougher frontier states like Tennessee and Kentucky. This sparked a market revolution. The internal improvements, the creation of an industrial infrastructure, and the stabilizing of the American economy after the War of 1812 became known as the American system. This system required a more active role of the federal government and created an idea that was known as economic nationalism, where the United States would become fully independent of other countries with its economy and turned to America's first to try to get the supplies and the products that they needed. The first proponent of the American system was Henry Clay. He later became the Speaker of the House. If you want to know more about Henry Clay, he is a direct ancestor of Miss Kenney, and she told me a lot about that. And if you want to know a lot of stuff about Henry Clay, she knows a lot of interesting stuff about him. But the American system championed a few things. It championed a national banking system. It saw that we needed to have that in order for stability and to be able to work together as different sections of our country, as well as being able to trade globally. We also needed to have protective tariffs to help the fledgling industry of the United States be protected. And we needed to have transportation improvements so that we could get manufactured goods from one area of the country to the other to help improve the American economy. These improvements were financed by raised sales prices of federal lands that came from Louisiana Purchase areas of the country and areas of the country that were still being sold out between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. After the demise of the Federalist Party, the Democratic Republicans remained as the only viable party. This period of one-party rule is known as the Era of Good Feelings, which was grabbed from a newspaper headline talking about James Monroe's presidency. After the conclusion of the War of 1812, the United States never fought another war with Great Britain. In fact, the two nations formed close diplomatic ties. One of the first steps in this process was the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, which ended the naval arms race on the Great Lakes. Both sides agreed to limit the number of warships on the lakes. Both were trying to have more naval power to help protect their interests, the British from the Canadian side and the Americans from the American side. And both sides agreed to limit their number of warships on the lakes to come to a more peaceful resolution. The next effort was the Convention of 1818, which settled the northern limit of the Louisiana Territory at the 49th parallel. It also agreed to joint occupancy of the Oregon Territory and allowed Americans to fish off of Newfoundland and Labrador, which are parts of Canada on the East Coast. The United States now stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains. Only Spanish America kept it from straddling the continent. However, Spain still controlled the territory of Florida and a narrow bit of land from its panhandle to the Mississippi River. The Americans, during James Monroe's presidency, actually secured and purchased Spanish Florida from Spain for about $15 million during his presidency. This area, before he purchased it, even afterwards, was a lawless zone where bandits and Indians set up their headquarters because U.S. officials could not legally cross the border. However, we have a man who comes in as president, or before he's president, as general. His name is Andrew Jackson, who ignores that border. But after 1819, this is what the United States was looking like territory-wise. On the northern border, you can see from the Convention of 1818, the 49th parallel was established as the border between the United States and Canada. Here is the joint territory that was occupied by the United States and by Britain. However, later this 49th parallel becomes the border all the way across to divide those two, the interests of both countries. This area is a very contended section of the United States, and it comes into play very heavily in our next presentation. So, the economy fluctuated a lot. Like I said, some of it was because of national bank charters expiring, but even with the extension of the national bank, there were still some problems. In 1819, Great Britain was still the chief importer of the South's cotton, and because prices were rising because of the tariff of 1816, Great Britain turned to its own colony, which was India, to obtain some cheaper cotton. Although they still did purchase stuff from the South, the Southern economy and cotton took a big hit when they started going to India. This revealed the fragility of the United States economic system. And although a depression did not occur, a panic most certainly did. It led to reckless bank lending. It alarmed the people and made them very nervous that they were not going to be able to sustain themselves, and especially panicked in the South. Slavery was a percolating issue from the beginning of our nation, and every so often it would come back to the forefront. The Missouri Compromise was one of the most important negotiations about slavery and its expansion to ever occur in the history of the United States, well, until the Civil War. After the Revolution, the United States followed an alternating pattern when admitting states into the Union. First one slave would be admitted, then a slave state would be first one slave state would be admitted, then a free state. When Missouri requested admittance, there were 22 states. There were 11 free states and 11 slave states. So if you look at this map, you can kind of picture what I'm talking about. There was no such policy that existed for states that were formed from the Louisiana Territory. So if you look at this map, this is the Mississippi River. And so all of the states that had been admitted this time, since Louisiana crossed that border, since they had been admitted, they were alternating. Ohio would be admitted, then Kentucky would be admitted. Vermont would be admitted, then Tennessee would be admitted. I don't know exactly what the order was, but that's what they would do. When Missouri applied for admittance, there were 11 free and 11 slave, but this would throw off the balance because Missouri wanted to be admitted as a slave state. Eventually, Missouri did gain statehood, and an agreement was reached that no more slave states would be allowed north of the 3630 parallel, which is this line right here. None would be allowed north of that. At the same time, Maine was admitted and became a state, so it was still seen as balanced, but this deepened the concept and the idea of there were sections of our country. There was most definitely a north, there was a south, and the states pitted against each other because of their interests in whether or not they were slaves or free states. Also, at this time, we had economic nationalism. That was the country establishing itself free of other economies and independent of others. We also talked about this idea of nationalism during the War of 1812, how there was an American identity, and Americans were suddenly their own nationality, and they were a power to be reckoned with internationally. People were recognizing us as a country. In addition to these two forms of nationalism, there was an idea of judicial nationalism. John Marshall, who was the one who handed down the Marbury versus Madison decision that we talked about in class yesterday, extended the powers of the Supreme Court to provide a more nationalist role of the federal government in state affairs. So it was also this judicial nationalism was that the federal government was exercising more control over the states. In the landmark 1819 case, Dartmouth versus Woodward, John Marshall's decision removed the power of the states to modify contracts on a whim. So states couldn't change the contract. This was a contract with a college, and that the state couldn't retract that. So that took away a little bit of the power of the states. The relationship between the state and the federal government was forever changed when Marshall issued a ruling in his next case, which was McCulloch versus Maryland, which was in 1819. This case involved the right of the national government to create a bank. This has been an argument that has been in place ever since Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson sat across from each other in Washington's cabinet. But because it wasn't specifically mentioned in the Constitution, somebody else, the state of Maryland, was sued by McCulloch, saying that he could set up his own bank. And even though it wasn't specifically mentioned in the Constitution, Chief Justice Marshall ruled that Article 1, Section 8 gave power to Congress to charter a bank, because it was one of those implied powers that was to create necessary and proper entities for the country to operate. He created the idea of implied power. Necessary and proper is in the Constitution, implied power is not. And he created the idea through this Supreme Court decision that the federal government is implied powers to do things that will make it necessary and proper for the country to operate. And a third landmark decision from the Supreme Court at this time, Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, John Marshall exerted the right of the nation to regulate state commerce. Not only was there more involvement from the Supreme Court to declare constitutional and unconstitutional law, it was also gradually increasing and strengthening the federal government's power. It was defining that line between the federal government and the states, using the Constitution as the basis of who had what power. This is a picture of one of the most influential documents ever written in our country. This letter from James Monroe, who was president, asking Thomas Jefferson for advice on foreign politics, laid the foundation work for what was known as the Monroe Doctrine, how the United States would handle foreign policy and European settlement in this hemisphere for the next 100 years. Continuing his diplomatic successes on land issues, John Quincy Adams, who was at this time serving as a foreign diplomat, completed a treaty with Russia in 1824 that defined the Oregon Territory's southern boundary. The Russians had Alaska, and then Great Britain and the United States settled on the disputed Oregon Territory, and then the United States later would acquire the Oregon Territory. California was established as a Spanish territory, as Mexican territory. So that treaty was very important for the definition of the West Coast and who owned what on that side. During the French Revolution, Spain had ignored its Latin American colonies, which had rebelled against their motherland. By 1823, this became apparent that Europe was willing to go to war to retake these colonies. James Monroe issued a statement declaring that the New World was no longer open to colonization by Europe. These are the 4 points of his Monroe Doctrine. We are going to discuss the Monroe Doctrine in class on Monday, so these are just the general ideas of it. His idea was basically, you stay on your side of the world, we'll stay on our side. The United States wouldn't interfere with European colonies. We would also keep out of European affairs. We would not be part of their wars. This is the basic idea. So if you know these 4 points, when we talk about the Monroe Doctrine in class, it will make things a little bit easier. We're done with the presentation. 2 important terms that I discussed in this lecture were nationalism and sectionalism. For your assignment, I would like you to write down your explanations of each term, and then I would like you to cite 2 examples from the time period, use dates, names, whatever, to support your explanation. If you need to use online resources to support your ideas, you are welcome to do that. However, I am not expecting a ton of writing on this assignment. 1 page, 1 side, half of it on nationalism, half of it on sectionalism, just enough to give you a working idea of the difference between nationalism and sectionalism and the roles that these 2 ideas played in the developing of the United States in the from like 1815 to 1825. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, keep working on your research paper, which is due a week from Friday on November 10th. And I will see you in class. Have a fantastic weekend, people.